What are the signs, houses, and nakshatras involved in good and bad romantic relationships? Here are some answers based on my statistical analysis. So let me first explain what's involved in the statistical analysis here. I have 96 charts submitted by people who wanted to participate in my relationship compatibility research. And for each chart, I know the type of relationship or relationships they've been involved in, whether it's been pleasant or unpleasant for them, and the number of years that the relationship lasted. So I can run analysis on these charts and see what factors are involved in people who have good relationships, bad relationships, long relationships, and short relationships. And that's exactly what I've done. Now the results here with the signs are very fascinating. Now here we're talking about for the goodness or pleasantness of a relationship. The worst sign for relationships is Scorpio. Now why is that? It's just because Scorpio is so passionate and individualized. And the best sign for relationships is Virgo. Now Virgo is the best by far. Twice as much as Scorpio is the worst, Virgo is the best. Virgo occurred 120% more often, roughly, in good relationships than in bad. Why is Virgo so good? Because Virgo is very caring, concerned, and pays attention to detail. So this is some wisdom from you to take away from this statistical analysis. And the wisdom is this: if you want to have a good relationship, don't be so concerned with your individual personal passion, and be more concerned with paying attention to the details about that relationship and taking care of or serving, like Virgo does, the partner. And when I do the same analysis for longevity instead of goodness, pleasantness, still Scorpio comes out to be the worst sign for longevity. Sagittarius also turned out to be not so great for long-term relationships. Whereas the best signs for long-term relationships were Leo and Aquarius, which are two fixed signs, as well as Pisces. And these are about 60% occurring more often in long-term relationships than in short-term. Scorpio then is coming up as a toughie in both the pleasantness of a relationship and the longevity of it. So the wisdom there is really that passion and intensity and so forth is not actually what makes a great long-term relationship. And especially individuality and individual opinion and experience is not part of the recipe of good, lasting relationships. Now, so far we've looked at a conglomerate of everything in any sign. Let me point out a few specific placements that were stand out. So for the pleasantness of a relationship, specifically to have the sixth Lord in Virgo, because it's on this topic of enjoying or liking to serve and be attentive upon another person. Also to have the first Lord in Virgo, and to have Ketu in Pisces, which puts Rahu in Virgo. Also Saturn in Virgo and Jupiter in Virgo are really good, specific ones. So really Virgo is the king. For bad or negative indicators in terms of how pleasant a relationship will be, specifically to have the eighth Lord in Aries was one of the worst placements. It might be great for whatever you might be into as a person with the eighth Lord in Aries, but it's not great for long-term, pleasant relationships. Aries is very independent, masculine, freedom-loving. To put the sexuality there might sound great, but it's not really great. To have sexuality be very adventurous and freedom-loving and independent. And another thing which is not really great with Aries is to have Venus there. Venus was one of the specific standout negatives for pleasant relationships when it's in Aries. Sun in Taurus is also a difficult indicator. So third Lord or Sun in Taurus, Venus or eighth Lord in Aries, and the sixth Lord in Sagittarius. As for having long-term relationships, having the first Lord in Scorpio was a very specific indicator of not being able to have long-term relationships so well. Fourth Lord in Scorpio also, Sun in Scorpio also, or Saturn in Sagittarius. So really the wisdom that we're getting from all this data is, wow, a lot of this fire and Mars kind of stuff doesn't mix well with relationships. So the wisdom there is, hey man, independence is not conducive to relationships. Freedom is not conducive to relationships. If you want freedom and you want good relationships at the same time, that's not going to work. That's like trying to make a left turn and a right turn at the same time. Yeah, I know you might want to convince yourself that you can do that, but I'm saying that you can't, and the statistics are saying that you can't. If you want long-term relationships, if you want good relationships, the Mars kind of independent, freedom, loving stuff detracts from it. Fiery type of self-reliant stuff detracts. Now, as for planets and lords and houses, I did a video on that previously already, just to quickly touch base on what's indicated in there, so we have this all wrapped up in one video. In terms of how pleasant or unpleasant a relationship will be, the 6th house turns out to be the worst house to have occupied, and the 9th house turns out to be the best. So 6 is the worst. The runners up to 6, however, they're not even very close to 6, but they're still mentionable, is the 10th house and the 5th. In terms of the good houses, the 9th is the best, but pretty close to the 9th house also is the 7th, which makes sense, and the 2nd, which also makes sense. In terms of longevity for relationships, the 5th house is really lousy. The 11th house is also not the best for long-term relationships. Okay, and as for good houses to have occupied for longevity, 8. The 8th house is the best. This may not be conventional modern astrological wisdom, but this is conventional classical astrological wisdom that the 8th is the house of longevity. A very close runner-up is also the 7th house, which also makes sense since it's the house of relationships. As for specific placements relating to the pleasantness or goodness of a relationship, to have the 6th Lord in the 5th house was the worst indicator. And to have the 11th Lord in the 7th house was the best. Also, 12th Lord in the 3rd house is not great. 8th Lord in the 7th house is not great. But to have the 8th Lord in the 11th house is great. And to have the 2nd Lord in the 9th house turned out to be great. As for planets, to have Saturn in the 5th house was not good. Also, to have Venus in the 1st house was not so good for pleasant relationships. Also, having Jupiter in the 12th house wasn't so great. And as far as good planetary placements, the one that was a real standout, K2 in the 8th house, Rahu in the 2nd. And it has to do with how deep K2 is and how well it goes with the 8th. So K2 in Pisces is very good because it goes really well with Pisces. K2 in the 8th house is really good. Venus in the 11th house is a very good indicator for pleasant relationships. Venus in the 1st, not so much, overemphasis on one's needs. But Venus in the 11th house, needs are fulfilled easily. And Moon in the 12th house, very interesting. Happened a lot more often in pleasant relationships than unpleasant relationships, and it has to do with the humility. So you're seeing Virgo is very good with relationships, and Moon in the 12th house is along the same lines of humility and willingness to serve. It's such an important thing for making relationships good. As for specific placements affecting the longevity of relationships, again, the 6th Lord in the 5th house. So the 6th Lord in the 5th house is really a bad indicator for both the pleasantness of a relationship and the length that it'll endure for. So we don't like to see the 6th Lord in the 5th house for anything about relationships. But we do like to see the 1st Lord in the 8th house. So again, the 8th house is the indicator of longevity. We also don't like to see 11th Lord in the 12th house because the 11th house is felicity. So when things are not really so felicitous, the longevity will also go down. 8th Lord in the 12th house, we don't want to lose the Lord of longevity by putting it in the 12th house. 4th Lord in the 1st house was an interesting one. Came out up a lot statistically, and I don't really know what kind of wisdom that's conveying. 10th Lord in the 4th house came up statistically a lot. in relationships that didn't last a long time. That's because the 4th house is the stable point, and the 10th lord is the opposite point. So the 10th lord is the movement point. So the 10th lord in the 4th house indicates instability. In terms of planets, we didn't like Jupiter in the 12th, so that's another one. Jupiter in the 12th was both bad for the goodness or pleasantness of a relationship and also bad for the longevity of it. Saturn in the 5th also came up in both cases. Saturn in the 5th is not good for the pleasantness of a relationship, nor is it good for the longevity of a relationship. Too much criticism. But also Saturn in the 5th house indicates criticism, and it also indicates detachment. We did like to see Saturn in the 12th house, however, whereas we don't want to see Jupiter in the 12th house. We like to see Saturn in the 12th house. Saturn in the 12th house turned out to be an indicator of long-term relationships, because Saturn and the 12th house have a lot in common. So Saturn, the planet of longevity, does well there. But don't put Saturn in the 2nd, and don't put Mercury in the 12th. That's the summary of the findings for specific placements in houses and how it affects relationships. Now let's get on to something really interesting that isn't often explored, and only really Vedic astrologers would explore this at all. These are the Nakshatras, which are the Indian lunar mansions. So these are the Indian constellations. And how did the nakshatra placements indicate good and long-lasting relationships? So we found a definite, strong spike of goodness related to Purva Phalguni, which only makes the most sense in the world, because the Phalguni nakshatra is the nakshatra of bonding and coupling and making babies and having relationships, forming marriages. And a close runner-up was Śrav. So Śrav literally means 1,000 joinings. Remember that. If you got my books on the nakshatras, you'll know the etymology of this word. And so liking to join together is the nature of Śrav. Anurādhā isn't a great relationship nakshatra. And close behind Anurādhā at 40% are Kṛttikā and Aśvinī. So Kṛttikā is because of the critical nature of it and separative nature. Kṛttikā is a critical and separative nakshatra. And Aśvinī seems to also have a problem of being difficult to satisfy and wanting a lot. Now, as for the longevity, very good nakshatra to have occupied for longevity in general is Śravana nakshatra. 70% more cases of long-term relationships with Śravana occupied. And Puṣya is also good for longevity of a relationship. It's 50% more often in long term. So why Śravana? Because Śravana likes to listen. So this is similar to the goodness of Virgo. You have to be willing to pay attention to the partner for a relationship to work and last a long time. You have to be willing to listen and learn, and that's what Śravana nakshatra is all about. Negative nakshatras for longevity, it's not surprising, it's Viśākhā. Viśākhā coming up 60% more of the time in short-term relationships than in long-term relationships. And here you have the problem of Viśākhā is too intense. It will commit very drastically at first and then change its mind very drastically. Equally difficult as Viśākhā is Jyeṣṭha, again not a surprise. Both of these nakshatras also have in common that they like to be the best. They're very goal-oriented. So being goal-oriented is not very good for enjoying a relationship. Take that away as some wisdom. Being the best is also not very good if you want to have a great relationship. Take that away as another wisdom. Now, specific placements regarding pleasant relationships. The most positive placement to have is to have the 9th lord in Purva Phalguni. Totally makes sense. And just about any lord in Purva Phalguni does well too, especially the 2nd, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. A runner-up here is to have the 11th lord in Śravana or Magha, or to have the 6th or 9th lord in Śrav. The negatives, on the negative side, is to have the 3rd lord in Kṛttikā. Too much sharpness, too much ambition, too much maleness, too much drive to be able to settle down and have a good, pleasant relationship. Also, the first lord in Swati only makes perfect sense, right? Swati, too individualized, too individualistic. First lord in Swati. Fourth lord in Kṛttikā is also not good. Also to have the fourth lord in Magha. So Magha sometimes is good, sometimes is not so great. 11th lord is in Magha was a good sign. Fourth lord in Magha is not a good sign. Magha is very powerful and commanding. I mean, the 11th lord there indicates a knowledge of enjoyment. Having the fourth lord there indicates a heart that's a little bit too authoritative and not compliant enough. Another interesting one is to have the second or sixth lord in Anurādhā. Anurādhā was mentioned as not being good overall, and one of the placements that's particularly not good is the second lord or the sixth lord there. Also to have Saturn in Anurādhā or Mars is not there. So you see, mostly it's about having malefics in Anurādhā, which is not a great indicator of being able to have your desires fulfilled or be able to fill other people's desires. Some of the best placements to have for planets were to have the Jupiter or Venus or Saturn in Purva Phalguni. And there's another very interesting one I'd want to mention. Ketu, as we saw with the houses, did very well in the 8th house. We saw Ketu with the signs doing very well in Pisces. In terms of Nakshatras, Ketu does great in Purva Bhadrapada. It's the same reason why Ketu does great in Pisces. The same reason why Ketu does great in the 8th house is the same reason why it does great in Purva Bhadrapada. So one thing to take away from this is when Ketu is in the right spot, mystical depth, not intense or passionate depth, but the mystical, psychological, thoughtful depth gets brought out. And that's very good for relationships, is to have depth in the psychology, depth in the experience. Like, you don't need to have sex 5 times a day, but when you have sex, you need to have it in a deep way. You don't need to constantly giving presents to people, but when you do give a present, it needs to mean something. So that's the thing that Ketu brings to relationships. It makes things deep. So putting Ketu in the right spot is one of the key indicators that things will go well for a person, especially for relationships. Now, I'm not reading off every single placement that's positive and negative, outstanding. So look in the description. I'll include a shorthand list of all of them. Or slow down or pause the video and look at the graphs. Or go to my Facebook where I post these graphs as images. The final thing to look at before we go to this very interesting conclusion is what are specific placements indicating long-term relationships or short-term relationships. 5th lord in Magha is very indicative of a long-term relationship. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in a good relationship though, but it means long-term. 9th lord in Purva Phalguni, on the other hand, indicates both a pleasant relationship and a long-term relationship. Okay? So you do have to be careful about separating these two types of relationships, pleasant or unpleasant versus long and short. And you can have long-term unpleasant relationships and short-term pleasant relationships. So something like a 5th lord in Magha indicates only the longevity of a relationship being good, not the pleasantness of it. But something like 9th lord in Purva Phalguni, it comes up for both longevity and pleasantness. Negative for longevity is the 1st lord in Viśākhā or the sun in Viśākhā. Sun in Viśākhā was also negative for pleasantness. 1st lord and sun are very similar. It's very self-oriented. Viśākhā is very goal-oriented. So 1st lord in Viśākhā, the sun in Viśākhā, it really brings out that sense of Viśākhā becoming too self-focused and self-serving, which does not work in relationships. That's what you want to take away from this. But it's also very interesting to note Venus in Anurādhā is a negative indicator for longevity. Not necessarily a negative indicator for pleasantness, but a negative indicator for longevity. Okay, now I want to finish the video with this one very interesting discovery. if we look at the graph for the overall goodness, combine the goodness and the longevity together for the signs or the nakshatras, or even just look at any one of those separately, we'll notice a pattern, a typical sine wave curve. Sine wave goes up and then comes down to the midline, then goes below the midline and comes back up. Well, that's exactly the way the sun moves, exactly the way the zodiac and all the planets move through the zodiac in relation to the equator. They follow this sine wave pattern. They start at the equinox, come up to a solstice, come back down to an equinox, go down to a solstice, come back up to the equinox, and start over again. So the data for relationship compatibility is following that same pattern as the zodiac itself follows. Even when you look at the nakshatras, but when you think about the signs and the current location of the nakshatras in relation to the signs. See, the signs are tropical. They're bound to the equinoxes and solstices. The nakshatras change their relationship to the equinox and solstices. So when you look at the data in relation to the signs, it becomes obvious what the sine wave is all about. The sine wave has its major points at the solstices and equinoxes. The beginning of Aries and the beginning of Libra are the two equinoxes. The beginning of Cancer and the beginning of Capricorn are the two solstices. So you have crossing the line in between Pisces and Aries, in between Gemini and Cancer, and roughly in between Virgo and Scorpio, so pretty much right on Libra. As the signs approach the equinox, they become more and more advantageous to relationships. So for example, Virgo is the sign that's right in front of the descending equinox, the southerly equinox. When the southerly section, the descending point is even more important because it's western. So it's not focused on self like the northern or ascending equinoxes at Aries. It's focused on others. So as the signs go from Cancer, Leo, Virgo, they become progressively more advantageous to relationships. As soon as you pass the equinox, it suddenly becomes very disadvantageous to relationships with Scorpio. So the most advantageous sign to relationships we found was Virgo. It's on one side of the southerly equinox, and then the least advantageous sign for relationships was Scorpio. It's on the other side. So as you approach an equinox, it becomes better and better for relationships. And as you leave the equinox, it's worse and worse. The more close you are to having left the equinox, the worse it is for relationships. So that totally makes sense because the equinox signifies equality, equal length of day and night, sameness. That's what we're really learning about relationships from this study. Relationships are not about who's the boss, who wears the pants, or any of that crap. Relationships are about how equal are we, how one are we, how unified are we. In any relationship where you're getting one person trying to lead the other consistently all the time, it's never going to be smooth. And in relationships where people are comfortable giving and taking with each other, being equals, supporting each other, that's where the relationships are good.